Hi guys, welcome to the channel and my name is Vishnu Kiryan and today we are going to talk all you guys want to know about exposure triangle. So exposure triangle consists of three vertices of one ISO, the shutter speed and the aperture. If you are a 90s kid, you would have the opportunity to shoot and see what is a film camera. And I am not talking about the huge expensive camera gears that I have used for shooting films, but rather the small cameras which you and your family had used to shoot your pictures of yourself. So, producing a photo from this film is a really long process. The red light, dipping it in chemical substances, all is a long process, which is not really important. The important thing is the relationship of reproducing a film is much like writing an ink pen on a paper. If you write really slow, the ink blots the paper. If you write really fast, the ink doesn't catch in the paper. So there is a correct pressure and time so that the ink pen can write on a paper. That is why people train small kids with ink pen rather than giving them the ball pen in first hand. Much like that, film is really sensitive to light. Too much of light, it turns the film to overexpose and be completely white. And if there is too little of light, then it will be completely black and really less in information. So there is a perfect point of light where the film can expose correctly. In order to understand what is ISO, we need to really go back in history to know how cameras were built. If you've seen Charlie Chaplin films, these films were shot on a camera which have a fixed ISO. At that time, ISO was fixed at 25K. In order to expose this shot, Charlie Chaplin had to do a lot of effort behind the scene. They usually shot these kind of shots in a stage and with the presence of direct sunlight, having a huge diffuser on top so that it has a evenly spread light. Back then, it was really hard for a filmmaker to expose one scene. Film cameras back then had only one ISO inbuilt on them, or the sensor of the camera has only one stop sensitivity. So the jump from a camera which have a fixed ISO of 25K to an ISO of 160 and 320 was happening on a very long scale of years. And this is talking about cameras which shot in black and white images. Meanwhile, color cameras had a really low ISO at that time. One of my favorite movies, Vertigo, which was directed by Alfred Hitchcock, was shot on a camera which have a constant ISO of 25K. And yes, it is beautiful as hell. ISO is not very complicated. It just represents the sensitivity of the sensor inside the camera. So if you want to expose a frame which is really bright, then you have to dial down the ISO number. And for the same camera, if you want to expose a really dark scene, you have to bump up the ISO inside the camera so that sensitivity inside the sensor is really high. Like I said, if the pen doesn't have much ink inside it, you have to press it more to extract that ink inside the paper. That is what happens if you bump up the ISO. You are exposing for the same camera in a really low light situation. The other alternative to expose a frame correctly even at a bright area is using ND filters or a high aperture. That is the second point or the second vertex of the exposure triangle. So I have been talking about exposing an image throughout the video. A good exposed image is an image which has the brightest part of the image not completely white and the darkest part of the image not completely black. What does it actually mean is, if in a digital frame you have a really white background or a white part of an image, the information inside that image doesn't hold anything. That means if you want to color grade an image like this, you can't do anything in the brightest part. Everything that you are done is only in the midtones and the shadows. And if you have an image like this where the shadows are really black, there is no bumping up the shadows. So a good exposed image is an image which has the brightest part of the image not fully white and the darkest part of the image not fully black. That being said, it's a creative decision. You may shoot an image which you are slightly overexposing or underexposing, depends on the tone and the vision you have behind the camera. So, in order to expose you can also use other techniques rather than going for ISO. That is the other two vertices of the triangle, that is shutter and aperture. So let's talk about shutter. The next vertex of the triangle is shutter speed. So shutter is actually like a window, it opens and closes. Like ink on paper, you are responsible when the ink has to stop flowing and when the ink has to flow. Likewise, in cameras, shutter is actually measured in minutes and seconds. In modern cameras, shutter can open for a really long period like hours and even for a fraction of seconds like 1/8,000th of 1 second. So what does shutter do? Imagine you have a frame which has less or no motion inside it. Any shutter angle will give you an image which is really sharp. But on the other side, if you have a frame or image in which one part of the image is still and the other part of the image has motion, then having a really high shutter angle will introduce a blur in the region where there is motion. And this blur which is happening inside the frame is known as motion blur, which is a really undesirable part when it comes to photography, where photos are generally aimed to be really crisp and really sharp. And I emphasize generally, there are creative photos where blurriness does introduce inside the photography, but where is it useful? Yes, you guessed it, in cinematography and film, motion blur is a very creative part of film. So everybody is now actually fascinated with the new thing known as time-lapse or hyperlapse. This whole creative genre is actually derived from the concept of shutter speed. Using the motion blur in a creative way, nowadays cinematographers and filmmakers are using it to do lot of effects and trying to tell story in a very different ways. So what else does shutter actually do? It's not just motion blur inside the picture, it is more to that. Well, imagine you have to shoot in a really sunny day and even the lowest setting inside the camera is not good enough. See how the highlights are blown off here. What do? Professionally speaking, use ND filters to expose the scene correctly and stick with your FPS rule. Alternate and cheaper and faster solution is bump up the shutter speed and you get the perfect exposure. But you have to be careful. Bumping up the shutter speed usually doesn't cause much problem. Rather than having a crisp motion, nothing much else is disturbed. While turning down is a major problem sometimes. Well, that's the topic for another day. If you want to know about why, then subscribe to the channel because I will be making a separate video on shutter speed alone. Now, let's go for the third point or the third vertex, which is aperture. So, understanding aperture, you need to really date back in history. Like I said, back then film cameras were not really flexible in terms of ISO and shutter speed. So filmmakers needed a third aspect whereby they can expose the image really good. That came the idea of aperture. If you look closely, aperture is not a camera specific modulation. Like ISO and shutter speeds which can be manipulated inside the camera, aperture can only be manipulated on the lens. So back then, this theory was actually used in microscopes and telescopes for viewing the image clearly. Aperture is actually noted in f-stop or t-stops. It ranges from 0.5 to 22 to 44. It doesn't matter. What you have to know is what is this number. It is actually the size of the diameter inside the lens. More the diameter, more light is passed through the lens to the sensor inside the camera. The lesser the diameter, less light is passed inside the lens to the camera. This is where the tricky part happens. The f-stop or t-stop is actually the inverse of the diameter. The higher the f-stop means smaller the diameter. The lower the f-stop means higher the diameter. Over the years, when camera gears have significantly improved their technology by introducing variable ISO and good shutter speed, filmmakers saw or noticed that this aperture can be used for a creative purpose. Not just letting the light inside the camera, but for introducing the bokeh or the background blurriness. Understanding the concept and why this inversion happens inside the t-stop value is not really important. Working a camera doesn't really required to know what is actually happening inside the camera. While it is useful, it is not necessary. It's much like driving a car. You don't really know what actually happens inside a car at a really large detail, but you do know how to steer a steering and change the gear and do the accelerator and pedals. Now, the interesting thing is these three vertices are really interconnected. What I mean is, if you want to expose a really bright image or a really bright scene and your ISO cannot go below 100, what you can do is change your shutter speed or aperture to expose this image. Likewise, if you want the image to be really having a shallow depth of field or having bokeh, you can reduce the aperture number. That is done with the cost of really brightening up the image, which you can fix by ranging the ISO or the shutter speed. As I said, exposure triangle is an age-old technique used by filmmakers to expose the scene correctly. Nevertheless, there are other techniques and other things that are used to expose the scene, like expensive techniques like grayscale and even simpler techniques like histograms. But like all rules out there, this is not a mandatory curfew. You can break it if you want, you can bend it if you want. No one's there to question. At the end of the shoot, all it matters is the vision behind the camera. So if you want to give me some exposure, then do like the video and subscribe to the channel for more amazing content like this. Hope to see you soon in the next video. Peace.